one of the questions came up is why is not going through the center of a refuge more damaging than the exterior of the refuge? And so we decided to talk a little bit about conservation biology and island issues in terms of habitat fragmentation. So Vicki has written, I think, a one-page handout. Then she's going to do a presentation and talk about why it's so important to, if you're going to impact a piece of land or a refuge in particular, that you do it on the exterior boundaries rather than through the center of it, and the impacts to wildlife and people that type of impact generates. So
again, the 580 acre Chaska unit, we calculated on GIS, came up to 601, so that's going to lead to some numbers later on. So if you total them up, they're going to be a little bit different. But basically, say the Chaska unit. This is the Chaska unit. The part of the that is in this blue is the refuge part, the Chaska unit. So that's our boundary. This kind of shaded in area. That's about 601 acres. That's just based on our GIS system. Not exactly, but it's pretty close to that 601 acres total. And that's the entire unit. Mixture of floodplain forest and wetlands, floodplain habitat. And floodplain forest generally is declining both in this region and globally. And they're finding that a lot of the bird species, there's a lot of bird species that are dependent on these habitats. And they've been declining since like the 1960s. We've seen some figures, it's older data, that sometimes after about 40 to 50% of the bird species are in decline in these habitats. And the floodplain forest does have a lot of species of birds, even compared to like upland. I mean, the floodplain forest has a lot more diversity of birds, and they rely on those habitats. And they rely on large blocks of habitat. A lot of the literature shows larger blocks are better for birds because they need those specific habitats to survive in order to have viable populations. So one of the big factors that threatens the species is habitat fragmentation, and that's kind of what we're getting into here. And all of the alignments that we're looking at, the 3 alignments that we're mainly looking into, do portray habitat fragmentation in some way, some more than others. So we thought we'd better start with what is habitat fragmentation, what does that mean? And basically it's taking, and I'm not an artist, but I put some pictures up. So my kids have some artistic ability, they must have got it all from me because I don't have any left. But basically, what we're looking at in habitat fragmentation is, think of it as isolating habitats into islands. And by isolating habitats, I guess if you could pretend this is forest, like my trees are really nice here, but this is a forest, a large block of forest. And say we put in, it could be, say a train track goes through it, just for something different. A train track, it could be a road, it could be something else. And it goes through the unit. And basically what it does is divides it into 2 different islands. I mean, there could be several trails through here. Basically every time we put in a road or some other kind of railroad, a trail, something, it's putting things into separate islands of habitat. And what that does is that brings us into another term. It turns it into, makes it more edge habitat. So in this diagram, here is our forest, and this black line is our edge habitat. Now edge habitat is basically that transition zone between habitats. So say we have a wetland, or we have forest, and this zone right here would be our transition zone, or our edge. There's species that both like, that concentrate on our interior or our specific habitats, and there's also species that are generalists. And sometimes those are our more predatory species. In this, here's our edge. We have a forest, this is our edge, but every time we put something through a big block of habitat, we're making more edge habitat. We're making more generalist habitat. So by putting this through, all of a sudden our edge is here, and our edge is here. So here we have our islands of general habitat, or our specific habitat, and now we have more general habitat that's put right in the middle. And that general, or that transition habitat, has totally different characteristics than our specific habitats. It can have different sunlight, different moisture, different temperatures, and that's all things that those species are keying in on. And they call this like interior habitat, or sometimes in the literature I saw today, core habitat. It's the core or interior habitat. And then we call this the edge habitat. We thought it'd be good to kind of throw in an example. And kind of, we've done a lot of work in Chaska Lake like the last 3 years. We know some of the species that live there. And a forest specialist in that area in the floodplain might be a white-breasted nuthatch. We get them at our feeders here all the time. They're pretty common backyard bird feeder species, but they really like forest habitat. And they're more of our specialist. They want to be in that core area. But then everybody knows kind of what a blue jay looks like. A blue jay will come in and they can survive in more of that transition habitat. What can happen over time though is that specialist species in the middle, our white-breasted nuthatch, it likes that specific interior habitat, which we're going to talk about in more detail later. But they're in that interior habitat. The blue jays hanging out in our transition zone. And as we have smaller and smaller blocks of land, the blue jays can move into that area where those white-breasted nuthatches like to live. And before long, blue jays like to parasitize other birds, and all of a sudden we have blue jays going up, and we have white-breasted nuthatches going down in population. So basically what we have in these edge type effects and making these little islands, is we have these specific species that like specific habitats. These specialists are declining, and in some cases, if we have small enough little blocks of habitat, they might disappear. Where these generalists and these more predatory species on other birds, they're going to be increasing. So eventually some of these really specific things can disappear. This block and this bigger blocks is an important concept because all the literature, if you look at literature, it's very specific on different wildlife, what block sizes they like, but the general concept is bigger block size is better. If they have some more of that interior habitat to be in, they have that specialized habitat and less edge. And that's kind of our concept here when we're even looking at this looking at our refuge. You know, everything we do, if we're looking at acquiring a new piece of property or restoring a piece of property, we're looking for big blocks of land. That's kind of our overriding, I think, goal. I don't know if you call it mission, but it's our overriding goal is to make contiguous blocks of land. Now that might just be refuge. It might be pieces of private land that have similar habitats. It might be other public land. We're always looking for these big blocks of land. And because we know, I mean, all the studies point to that's important for wildlife.